All right, so let's dive into vendor relationships and agreements.
Okay.
And this is super important for anyone who is studying to take the CCSP exam.
Oh, absolutely.
This is where the rubber meets the road in cloud security.
Mhm.
Because let's face it, you can't go it alone in the cloud.
You really can't.
Right.
You're going to be relying on these vendors for everything.
Yeah.
From the infrastructure and the software and all your security tools.
Yeah, so it's not just about picking the coolest tech or finding the cheapest service.
No.
Right.
You got to think about these relationships very strategically.
Right.
Especially from a security perspective.
Okay, so let's say I'm building out my cloud infrastructure.
Okay.
What are some of the first things I should be thinking about in terms of vendor relationships?
So one concept that can really trip people up is vendor lock-in.
Oh, yeah.
It's really easy to get seduced by that flashy platform or slick integration, but you need to step back and ask yourself, what happens if this vendor raises prices through the roof?
Right.
What happens if the quality of their service takes a nosedive?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Can you easily migrate your data and applications to a different provider? These are the kinds of things you need to be asking yourself up front.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I can see how getting locked into a bad vendor relationship could just be a nightmare, especially from a security standpoint.
Yeah.
So how do I avoid that?
Due diligence.
Okay.
Due diligence is going to be your best friend here.
Oh.
You wouldn't hire an employee without checking their references, right?
Well, of course not.
The same goes for vendors.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
You really want to dig into their reputation, look for independent security assessments, audit reports, look for any history of data breaches or security incidents.
Oh, wow.
And don't be afraid to ask tough questions about their security practices and how they handle your data.
This is almost like being a detective, right?
Yes.
Gathering evidence, making sure the vendor is who they say they are.
Yes.
But, okay, so let's say I've done my homework. I found a vendor that seems pretty solid.
Good.
What are the next steps?
That's where the vendor lifecycle comes in.
Okay.
This is a structured approach to managing these relationships from start to finish.
Got it.
We're talking about 4 key phases here: selection, onboarding, maintenance, and offboarding.
Okay, walk me through it.
All right.
What happens in each of those phases?
So selection we've already touched on.
Okay.
That's your due diligence phase.
Got it.
But once you've chosen, your vendor onboarding is all about setting the ground rules and making sure everybody is on the same page.
Okay.
So this is where you'll hash out those technical details like data encryption, access controls, incident response procedures.
So it's not just about signing the contract and calling it a day.
Yeah.
There's a whole process of getting the relationship off on the right foot from a security perspective.
Exactly. You're laying the foundation for a secure and compliant partnership.
Okay.
And speaking of compliance, this is where you need to make sure that the vendor understands any specific regulations or standards that apply to your industry.
Right.
Like HIPAA for healthcare or PCI DSS for payment card data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want any surprises down the line where they're like, oh, we don't support that.
Exactly.
What about after onboarding? How do you make sure the vendor is staying on top of their security game?
That's where the maintenance phase comes in.
Okay.
This is about ongoing monitoring and assessment.
Gotcha.
Think of it like a car.
Uh-huh.
You wouldn't just drive it off the lot and never get an oil change.
Right.
Or check the tire pressure. Right. You got to stay on top of things.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of situation.
Right.
What are some ways that you can actually monitor a vendor's security posture throughout the relationship?
Well, there are a few key tools in your arsenal here.
Okay.
Regular security assessments are essential.
Okay.
This could involve questionnaires, vulnerability scans, penetration tests, really anything that helps you get a clear picture of their security controls.
Okay.
You might also consider independent audits, especially for those vendors who are handling really highly sensitive data.
So it's about keeping your finger on the pulse, making sure they're not letting things slip.
Exactly.
Now, I know we've talked a lot about due diligence and ongoing monitoring.
Right.
But what about the legal side of things?
Yeah.
Where do contracts fit into all of this?
Contracts are the backbone of any vendor relationship,
Okay.
especially when it comes to cloud security. They spell out the expectations, the responsibilities, and the consequences if things go wrong.
Right.
And in the cloud, where you're entrusting so much sensitive data to third parties, those contracts need to be rock solid.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so we've got the vendor lifecycle, we've got the importance of contracts,
Yeah.
but there are so many different types of agreements out there.
There are.
Can we unpack those a bit?
Sure.
What are some of the must-have agreements for anyone working in cloud security?
You're right. There's a whole alphabet soup of agreements: NDAs, SLRs, SLAs.
Right.
But let's start with the two that really matter when it comes to security and performance. Service level requirements, or SLRs, and service level agreements, or SLAs.
Okay.
And these are your way of setting clear expectations and holding your vendors accountable.
Okay. Break it down for me.
Okay.
What kind of expectations are we talking about here?
So think about those things that really matter for your cloud services to function securely and reliably.
Okay.
So system response times, for example.
Okay.
If you're running a critical application in the cloud,
Right.
you need to know that your vendor's systems are going to respond quickly to your requests.
Okay.
Otherwise, you could be facing some serious performance issues.
Oh, yeah.
Or even outages.
Oh, right.
And that's where the SLA comes in.
Okay.
You could specify a maximum response time, say 500 milliseconds, and the vendor is contractually obligated to meet that target.
So it's like setting a speed limit for their systems.
Pretty much.
And if they go over, there are consequences.
Absolutely. There might be financial penalties, service credits, or even grounds for terminating the contract if they're consistently failing to meet those agreed upon SLAs.
Wow. Okay, so it gives you some leverage.
Yeah.
And it helps ensure that you're getting the performance that you're paying for.
Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. What other kinds of things can you cover in an SLA?
Another big one is uptime or availability.
Right.
Think about it. If your cloud provider goes down, your entire business could grind to a halt.
Oh, for sure.
That's why those uptime guarantees are so crucial, especially for mission-critical applications. You might negotiate for 99.99% uptime, for example, which means the vendor can only have a total of about 53 minutes of downtime per year.
Wow, that's pretty stringent.
It is.
But I can see why it'd be important, especially for things like e-commerce sites or healthcare applications.
Absolutely.
Where every second counts.
Yes.
Are there any other performance metrics that should be addressed in an SLA?
Definitely data durability is another important one.
Okay.
You want to know that your data is safe and sound, even in the event of a hardware failure or a natural disaster.
Right.
So you might specify a certain level of redundancy or data replication in the SLA to ensure that your data is protected.
Got it.
You can also include metrics for data backup and recovery, outlining how quickly the vendor can restore your data if something goes wrong.
So SLAs really are like a safety net.
They are.
They give you that peace of mind and some recourse if the vendor doesn't deliver on their promises.
Absolutely.
But what about things that aren't directly related to performance?
Okay.
Like, what if I'm concerned about how a vendor handles security incidents?
That's where the SLR comes in.
Okay.
The service level requirements document.
Okay.
Think of this as the blueprint for the relationship, outlining all of those crucial security details that might not fit neatly into an SLA. You can specify things like incident response procedures, data encryption standards, vulnerability management processes, and even the frequency of security audits.
So the SLR is where you really get granular and make sure the vendor's security practices align with your organization's requirements.
Exactly. You're setting the bar for what's acceptable and what's not in terms of security.
Okay.
And remember, these agreements aren't just about protecting you from the vendor's shortcomings. They're also about holding yourselves accountable.
Right. It works both ways.
Exactly.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that your own organization is living up to its end of the bargain.
Yes.
In terms of security practices and data handling.
For sure.
Now, we've talked a lot about SLAs and SLRs.
We have.
But I know there's a bunch of other agreement types out there.
Oh, there are a lot.
Do any of those have a significant impact on cloud security?
Definitely. While SLAs and SLRs might be the headliners, there are a few other supporting actors worth mentioning. So, for example, data processing agreements, or DPAs, are crucial, especially in light of regulations like GDPR.
Oh, right, DPAs.
Yes.
Those are especially important if you're dealing with customer data from the European Union.
Yes, they outline how the vendor is going to handle that personal data, ensuring they are meeting those stringent privacy requirements.
Are there any other agreement types we should be keeping an eye on?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's talk about business associate agreements, or BAAs.
Okay.
Now, these are absolutely essential if you're in healthcare and you're dealing with protected health information, or PHI under high pay.
Right.
The BAA establishes the vendor's responsibilities for protecting that sensitive data, and it outlines the consequences if they fail to do so.
So BAAs are kind of like specialized DPAs for the healthcare world.
You could say that.
Making sure that patient data is handled with the utmost care and according to all those IPA regulations.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
Here's another one that's often overlooked. The Master Services Agreement, or MSA. Think of this as an umbrella agreement that covers a whole range of services that you might procure from a single vendor.
Right.
It establishes those overarching terms and conditions so you don't have to renegotiate everything from scratch every time you add a new service.
That sounds pretty efficient.
Oh, it is.
So the MSA sets the ground rules for the relationship,
Uh-huh.
and then you have more specific agreements like SLAs and DPAs for individual services.
That's right.
And I guess within that MSA, you could have statements of work, or SOWs, that outline the specific details for each project or service.
Yes, it's a hierarchical structure that helps you manage the complexity of multiple agreements.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on the different types of agreements.
Yes.
But let's get back to the heart of it. Data.
Okay.
We're putting so much trust in these vendors,
Right.
entrusting them with our most valuable asset.
It is a big leap of faith.
How do we make sure that our data is actually protected in the cloud?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it all comes down to control and transparency.
Okay.
You need to understand where your data is stored, who has access to it, and how it's being protected.
Yeah.
And the contract is your first line of defense here.
So we need to spell out all those data-related details in the contract.
You do?
What are some specific things that we should be looking for?
Definitely, first and foremost, data ownership.
Okay.
Just because your data is residing in the vendor's environment doesn't mean that you relinquish control over it.
Right.
The contract needs to unequivocally state that you retain ownership of your data,
Okay.
even if it's stored on the vendor's servers.
So it's like renting an apartment. You're using the space, but you still own your furniture and your belongings.
A perfect analogy.
What else should we be paying attention to in terms of data protection?
Data residency is another big one.
Okay.
Where is your data physically stored?
Right.
Different countries have different data privacy laws,
Uh-huh.
so you need to make sure that the vendor's storage locations align with your compliance obligations.
Got it. For example, if you're handling European Union citizen data,
Right.
you might need to ensure that that data stays within the EU.
That makes sense. You don't want to accidentally run afoul of data sovereignty laws.
No, you don't.
What about data encryption?
Yeah.
That seems like a no-brainer for protecting sensitive information in the cloud.
Absolutely. Encryption is your best friend when it comes to data security.
Right.
Make sure that the contract specifies what encryption standards the vendor will use,
Okay.
both in transit and at rest.
Got it.
And don't just settle for some vague assurances.
Mm-hmm.
Dig into the specifics. What encryption algorithms are they using? What key management practices do they have in place?
So we're not just checking a box that says encryption.
Right.
We're actually making sure they're using strong industry standard encryption methods.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
And don't forget about data access and control.
Okay.
Who within the vendor organization has access to your data?
Right.
Are there any subcontractors or third parties involved?
Mm-hmm. You need to understand that chain of custody and make sure that there are appropriate access controls and auditing mechanisms in place.
It sounds like we're really getting into the nitty-gritty here.
We are.
But that's probably a good thing when it comes to data security.
It is.
What about data retention and deletion?
Okay.
What happens to our data when we no longer need it or when the contract ends?
That's a crucial consideration, especially in terms of compliance and minimizing your data footprint.
Right.
The contract should clearly outline the vendor's data retention policies.
Okay.
How long will they keep your data after the contract terminates?
Mm-hmm.
What methods will they use to ensure that that data is securely deleted?
Right.
Will they provide you with a certificate of destruction?
Oh, wow.
These are all questions you need answers to.
So it's not enough to just say, delete my data.
No.
You need to know how they're going to do it and what safeguards they have in place to prevent any remnants from hanging around.
That's right.
What about data backups? Where are those stored and who has access to them?
Excellent point. Backups are essential for data recovery.
Right.
But they also represent a potential security vulnerability if they're not handled properly.
Right.
The contract should address backup storage locations, encryption standards for backups, and access controls.
Okay.
You want to make sure those backups are just as secure as the primary data.
All right. So we've covered data ownership, residency, encryption, access controls, retention, and backups.
Yes.
Anything else we need to worry about in terms of data protection?
One more thing, data breach notifications.
Okay.
What happens if the unthinkable occurs and the vendor experiences a data breach that impacts your data?
Oh, right.
The contract should outline their notification procedures,
Okay.
including timelines, contact methods, and the level of detail that they will provide.
Got it.
You need to know what to expect so you can respond quickly and effectively.
So we're not just hoping for the best.
Yeah.
We're planning for the worst and making sure we have a clear process in place if a breach happens.
Yes, exactly.
This is a lot to take in,
It is.
but it's clear that data protection is paramount in the cloud.
It really is.
It really is.
Yeah.
But even with the most ironclad contract, things can still go wrong.
Right.
What happens if a vendor starts cutting corners on security
Right.
or just isn't taking your concerns seriously?
That's where the right to audit comes in.
Okay.
Make sure your contract includes provisions that allow you to conduct independent security audits of the vendor systems and practices.
Oh, okay.
This could involve on-site visits, penetration testing,
You're right.
vulnerability assessments, or even reviewing their security policies and documentation.
So we're not just taking their word for it.
Nope.
We actually have the right to go in and verify they're doing what they promised.
Exactly.
That seems like a pretty powerful tool to keep vendors accountable.
It is.
But audits can be pretty time-consuming and expensive, right?
Yeah, they can be, but they're often worth the investment.
Okay.
Especially for those high-risk vendors who are handling sensitive data. And remember, you don't necessarily have to conduct the audit yourself.
Oh.
You can hire a third-party security firm that specializes in these types of assessments.
Got it.
They've got the expertise and independence to give you an objective evaluation of the vendor's security posture.
That makes sense. It's like getting a second opinion from a specialist.
Exactly.
But let's say we've done our due diligence. We've got a solid contract in place.
Okay.
We're conducting those regular audits.
Right.
What else can we do to kind of minimize risk in these vendor relationships?
One thing that often gets overlooked is ongoing communication and collaboration.
Okay.
Don't just treat your vendors like faceless service providers.
Right.
You want to actually build relationships with their security teams, have regular meetings to discuss security updates, emerging threats, and any concerns that might arise.
So it's about treating them like partners, not just vendors.
Exactly.
Working together to stay ahead of the security curve. But what happens if, despite your best efforts, things really go south?
Okay.
Like, what if a vendor experiences a major data breach that impacts your data?
That's when those indemnification clauses in your contract become really critical.
Okay.
Indemnification is all about who is financially responsible if something goes wrong.
Right.
You want to make sure that the vendor is obligated to cover your costs, including legal fees, regulatory fines, and any damages resulting from a breach.
So indemnification is like an insurance policy.
You got it.
That protects us if the vendor messes up.
Exactly.
But, these contracts can be pretty complex.
They can.
Are there any other clauses that we should be paying close attention to in terms of risk mitigation?
There are a few other gems worth highlighting.
Right.
For example, limitations of liability clauses can cap the vendor's financial responsibility, even in the event of a major breach.
Wow.
So make sure that those limitations are reasonable and don't leave you exposed to unacceptable levels of risk. You also want to watch out for clauses that attempt to exclude certain types of damages, like consequential damages or lost profits.
Right.
These can really significantly limit your ability to recover losses if something goes wrong.
So it's like playing a game of legal chess.
It is.
You got to be thinking several moves ahead and anticipate those potential pitfalls.
Absolutely.
It sounds like having a good lawyer on your side is pretty crucial when it comes to negotiating these cloud contracts.
Couldn't agree more. Don't try to be a hero and handle these complex agreements on your own.
Right.
Engage a legal counsel that specializes in cloud contracts.
Yeah.
They can help you navigate all those tricky clauses, identify those potential risks, and ensure your organization's interests are protected.
Excellent advice. Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into the world of vendor relationships and agreements.
It has.
We've covered so much ground, from due diligence and the vendor lifecycle to SLAs, data protection, audits, and even those tricky legal clauses.
We did it all.
What are some of the key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind as they're studying for that CCSP exam?
Well, first and foremost, security is a shared responsibility in the cloud.
Right.
Don't just assume that your vendors have it covered. You really need to be actively involved in assessing their security practices, negotiating strong contracts, and monitoring their performance throughout that relationship.
So it's about being proactive, not reactive.
Absolutely.
Taking ownership of cloud security and not just passing the buck to our vendor.
Exactly.
What else?
Documentation is key.
Okay.
Keep detailed records of your vendor assessments, contract negotiations, and ongoing communications.
Right.
This will help you stay organized,
Uh-huh.
but it'll also provide you with valuable evidence if any disputes arise down the line.
That's a great point. It's like having a security audit trail for your vendor relationships.
Yes.
Anything else?
One last thing. Don't be afraid to walk away from a bad deal. If a vendor isn't willing to meet your security requirements or address your concerns, it's better to just find a different partner.
Right.
Remember, your data and your organization's reputation are on the line.
Excellent advice. I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. Hopefully they're feeling more confident about navigating those complexities of vendor relationships and cloud contracts. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of cloud security.